Okay, so far today we've had a number of really good sessions outlining the problem of sexual exploitation and abuse in the aid industry and a number of the hurdles that are being put in front of all of us trying to stop the sexual exploitation and abuse and trying to hold people to account to that abuse. In the presentation I'm about to give will go for about 30 minutes. At any time, feel free to put questions and answers in the Q&A session, and I will, or the Q&A tab, and I'll answer them near the end of the session. Also, feel free to make your comments or points in the chat session as well. I'll be monitoring both the chat and the Q&A session. So this session, I want to talk about how is it that we proactively go out and find victims, why we need to go out and find victims, and how it is that we hold perpetrators to account. So now let's test my technological skill and let's see if I can adequately share my screen for a short presentation or a PowerPoint presentation that I will do along with this speech. So hopefully now you can all see the holding slide. We need to keep in mind what it is that we are trying to do here. It is increasing justice available to the victims of abuse. So the 5 topics that I want to cover in this session are: is there a need to proactively look for victims? Secondly, do we need an international body to do this? Thirdly, what is needed to create such a body? Fourthly, what are the barriers to creating such a body? And then finally, questions from yourselves. So let me go to that first topic. Is there a need to proactively look for victims? Well, on the left-hand side of the screen here, let's have a look at the case of the United States. According to the Brennan Center in the United States, less than 20% of sexual assaults are ever reported to the police. In other words, if you are just waiting for people to come forward in the US, you will miss 80% of the victims. Less than 20% are ever reported. The reasons for failure to report include a fear of retaliation and the fact that less than 0.5% of accused end up going to jail, going through a court, being found guilty, and going to jail. So for the victims, there is a feeling of hopelessness anyway. And then sadly, according to the Brennan Center, 8% of victims said, quote, according to the Brennan Center, they did not think the rape or sexual assault was important enough to report. That's in the United States. Well, what about in the developing world, over on the right-hand side of the screen? As Jessica Toll said in the first session from her desktop study, and as many of the speakers have talked about earlier today, the full scale of sexual exploitation and abuse in the aid industry is unknown. And therefore, because we don't know the scale, we don't know the underreporting rate. It's impossible to predict, although it is highly probable that reporting rates are significantly less in the developed world than in the Western countries, and even less against the aid industry for exactly these reasons: the fear of retaliation, the fear of being arrested if the victim was involved in transactional sex, as is the case in Haiti. Women were afraid by reporting the aid industry, they were actually confessing themselves to breaching Haitian law on prostitution. Thirdly, the need for the aid that is being offered, often called survival sex. And if you think about it in the context of the Food for Sex scandal that was talked about earlier today, if you're a family who's agreed to have one child be given up for sexual favors in return for getting the food from the aid worker, you're never going to report that because, firstly, the child thinks they're doing the right thing by the rest of the family, and the child will never want to get their parent into trouble. So they will never go forward and report. And we are talking about the context often in humanitarian settings where there is a breakdown of civil society and law enforcement anyway. Even without the breakdown of civil society and law enforcement caused by a natural disaster or conflict, there is weak law enforcement in many developing world countries. So there's no visible justice that's open to the victims, so no point. So it's not a big jump to say less than 20% of sexual assaults are ever reported to the police in the United States, and far fewer than that would be reported against the aid industry in the developing world. Let's, for the sake of discussion, call it 10%. That means if you are only waiting for victims to come forward, your best case scenario is that you are missing 90% of victims. What justice is there in a system where 90% of victims will never even be heard? And this is the key point. No matter how much reporting mechanisms are improved, waiting for the victims to come forward will only ever deal with a tiny minority of victims and abusers. Without seeking out and finding victims, the vast majority of perpetrators will always be free to repeat their abuses again and again. And this is one of the moral dilemmas we have in this work. Yes, we've got to be careful to apply good, ethical, rigorous standards. But every day we delay is a day that not only more victims are created, but more perpetrators get that sense of impunity and are emboldened to abuse even more women and children. Whilst we need to be careful that all ethical considerations are taken into account, there is a sense of urgency in implementing new ways of holding perpetrators to account, because every day delayed is a new victim created. Do we need an international body for this? Well, sexual exploitation abuse in the aid world is a multinational repeat crime. As we saw from the Oxfam scandal, abusers don't abuse once. They abuse multiple times in multiple countries. And the perpetrators and the organisations can often be from separate nationalities. The Oxfam scandal again, Oxfam was based in the UK, the perpetrator was based in Belgium, and the offences took place in Haiti. And as many of the speakers in the previous sessions have said, this area involves complex areas of ethics, victim protection, and child's rights, which require extremely well-trained people dealing carefully in complex areas of law and culture. This is why we need to create an international body with that expertise, with an independence from the systems already in existence. There is a need to create a fear of detection in the minds of future perpetrators, so we can turn the tables on them. Instead of the perpetrators feeling free to offend again and again and move from one organisation to another and one country to another, we need to ensure that future perpetrators might actually be scared that they might be found. But why else do we need an international body? The judicial criminal system accountability is multinational, and therefore evidence gathering and custody of evidence rules must be looked at through an international lens. Jane Connors, who is speaking in the next session, we had a chat a year and a half, 2 years ago, and we talked about the different rules of evidence that are required. And it's not just 194 rules of evidence that may be required for the 194 nation states members of the UN or thereabouts. Many jurisdictions, like my own in Australia, the criminal law is based by the state jurisdictions, like in the US. So there's many hundreds of jurisdictions, actually, people gathering evidence need to be aware of. That's why, again, we need an international organisation to do this, an organisation that can be aware of the rules and procedures of evidence in front of courts in many different jurisdictions. And justice is not criminal. It's also civil, especially when you're looking for child support orders. Again, the provision of how to get a child support order against a father will differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and an international organisation is needed to take into account the different processes you need to take place in the different jurisdictions. Again, with Madeline and Melanie, we heard this morning that they actually have the right to apply for British passports, even though it's not that important to them. If Madeline and Melanie's father was Australian, they would not have had that right, because the citizenship rules are different in different countries. Again, an international organisation that is looking after the justice for victims needs to be aware of the different rights, obligations and systems that victims may be looking at. A home for increased international research on the scale, causes and impacts of abuse, as well as The barriers to reporting abuse that we've been speaking about in this and previous sessions also highlights the need for us to ramp up our desire at an international level to stop talking about the problem and start solving the problem. The key point here is we need an independent body, free from the UN, free from the NGO system. Victims often find it hard to distinguish between international organisations. Really, does someone in the Democratic Republic of Congo understand the difference between UNDP and UNICEF, between Save the Children and World Vision, let alone sections of the organisations? Right now, we're asking victims to report to the same organisations or to the same structures. How can a victim perceive of themselves as getting justice when they're asked to make a complaint against the very same organisation that hosts the staff member that abused them? It's why we need an independent body. And what is needed to create such a body? Well, the first thing is this top bullet point. I hope this goes without saying. We need a desire to put victims' rights first. There are lots of areas we've spoken about today around ethical dilemmas, legal dilemmas, administrative dilemmas. And in my experience in the last 30 years, many of these dilemmas have been put up as a reason for inaction, which is why in the last 30 years we have seen very little meaningful change to victims on the ground. I first became aware of this issue when I worked in former Yugoslavia in the mid-1990s. And it's really sad to know there are some very good academics writing books in this area now who were in primary school when the whistleblower scandal happened and in secondary school when the food for sex scandal happened. I say that only to point out that this problem has been going on for decades, and it's time we put victims' rights first and we did something serious and meaningful so we don't come together in another 10, 15 or 20 years and wonder why there isn't any meaningful change. Secondly, of course, there needs to be an allocation of funding at the multilateral, multinational level. There needs to be a clarification on the interaction with existing international laws for underage sex, child support claims, citizen rights, and the right to know genetic heritage laws. All of these laws need to be updated with the changes in technology. Margaret talked earlier today about the case of Bridget and the ongoing legal cases we have in Canada. And one of the issues we are putting to the courts in Canada is why is it that a child support order needs to first be given in the court of the habitual domicile of the child? Why can't we go straight to the court of the habitual domicile of the father? These clarifications of laws between different countries also need to be made to empower such an international body to do its job. And of course, the last bullet point here, identifying and training key personnel with the right ethical training, with the right protections, with the right empathy to be able to look after the victims. Now, what are the barriers to creating such a body? We talked earlier this morning about people saying you're threatening our funding, or another version is this first bullet point, you are threatening all the good work being done in the aid industry. To which I say there are three types of people in the world. There are those abusing children, those covering up the abuse of women and children, and those trying to stop the abuse of women and children. And for those who think the third one is threatening all the good work, they need remedial lessons in ethics. Secondly, a great barrier to such a body has been the phrase re-victimize the victim. We all know you don't want to re-victimize the victim, but using that phrase to prevent justice, not enable justice, has often happened over the last 3 decades. Re-victimizing the victim has become an excuse for inaction, not an empowerment to look at the problems, get over the problems, find solutions to the problems, and still get justice. Legitimate concerns around ethics, privacy, and rights are all issues that can be solved if the decision is made to put victims' rights first and solve these problems and move on. Fourthly, in terms of barriers to creating such a body, of course, is a political will of the industry and governments who have been putting the reputation of the agencies before the protection of the victim to put it the other way around. Women and children's rights must be put in front of the protection of the agencies and the embarrassment of governments. So this is what I perceive as some of the great problems that we have in trying to solve the problem of sexual exploitation and abuse in the aid industry. Some of these problems are quite large. Some of them are challenging, but all of them we can get over. What I would like to do now is ask people, please whack in a question in the Q&A. Let's start to have a bit of a dialogue, because I know that many of these are great challenges that are facing. What do you think when I make a provocative statement like the phrase re-victimize the victim has been used for the large part of the last 30 years to prevent action as opposed to protect the victims? And what do we do between the balance of taking the time to get the ethical and legal protections right, but knowing that every day we take the time to do that, more victims are created, future perpetrators are empowered, and they abuse more and more. So let me go to the Q&A screen now, and let's see some of the questions that have come up. Firstly, who would fund the international independent body and where would it sit? That is a really good question. Clearly, who needs to fund it will largely have to be done by governments, which, like everything else, then means you start to question exactly what its independence does. Does it need to be set up like the International Criminal Court or a fully independent structure like that? And where would it sit? Again, like the International Criminal Court, I think it would be up to governments to say who's going to host it. Emma Grant asks, what is the risk of doing harm by identifying by name and photo and geographic location individual children, and how have those risks been mitigated? I'm assuming Emma is referring to Margaret's presentation of the children in her article in The Guardian. And I know that The Guardian and Margaret went through a lot of protection of the children before they were identified. But this also raises another question, because there are some circumstances in which a victim coming forward will re-victimise themselves. Some countries which still criminally outlaw extramarital sex, even in the case of rape, means it's very, very difficult for victims to come forward. And that again highlights the need why we need to have an international body with the right trained people to understand there are some jurisdictions in which getting justice for victims is particularly difficult. Anonymous asks, wanted to ask about prosecuting for underage rape versus getting father to pay maintenance. What do you consider? Well, you can do both. In the case of a child that's under the age of 16 when she was impregnated, that triggers the extraterritorial child sex tourism legislation in many of the Western countries. There is nothing preventing getting both a prosecution and a child support order against that father. Again, depending on the jurisdiction of the father, there will be a different procedure in which you need to go back through, both in the criminal and the civil courts. So the prosecution for an underage sex sits in the criminal system, and the claim for a child support order sits within the civil system. Anonymous also asks, where are we? Sorry, I've seen that one already. Would the body need an intergovernmental treaty basis if it's going to have any teeth? Possibly, yes. And this is a really critical element. We're only going to get meaningful change when governments start taking this seriously, and that's only going to happen when communities demand that governments do. And yes, it may need an intergovernmental treaty. It might start just with a couple of governments coming together, but we need to make the decision that enough is enough. When Kofi Annan, as Secretary General, first said the United Nations has zero tolerance for sexual exploitation and abuse, that was 19 years ago. I don't want to come back in 19 years and say we need to do something. The time is now. Anonymous asks, do you see a greater benefit of this independent body existing at international or local level? Wouldn't local, with global support, be more effective at intervention? I think that's potentially right. It's going to be different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So there needs to be an umbrella organisation that looks at the challenges. If you set something up at local level, that will be very good for the pastoral care of the victims, which is incredibly an important aspect of the work. However, remembering that you need to link the victim with the father's home jurisdiction, could be Canada, could be United States, even in the common law systems, even in the cases we've done out of the Philippines, and the law firm I chair does that work pro bono for many of them with the help of James Netto, we see the significant difference between the jurisdictions of Australia, the United States, United Kingdom, and Canada. So even if you were working locally with the pastoral care for the victims, you also need to work internationally when it comes to dealing with the jurisdictions and the laws that apply to the father. Elena Bondareva asks, have you recorded any difference in how seriously this is taken by organisations led by straight men versus women or LGBTQI+, or are the inaction excuses ubiquitous regardless of leadership? I think they're fairly ubiquitous. Elena, the chair of Oxfam, when the Oxfam scandal blew a couple of years ago, who was female, said that Oxfam had known about it for 10 years. And it was chaired at the time by a female. I think the International Development Committee has made its point quite clear that the institutions put the protections of themselves before the protection of the children. And as a number of speakers have mentioned in a number of the sessions this morning, this is an institutional problem. Yes, there are the individual perpetrators, but then there are the institutions behind those perpetrators that have covered it up, turned a willful blind eye, issued immunities, as Ed Flaherty talked about in the last session, or just chose not to report to the local police for enforcement at the appropriate time. Chippo asks, what are the social considerations in countries' jurisdictions of victims of this body's operations? Look, this is really, really important. And it underlines why we need the right people with the right training, because the social considerations in jurisdictions of the victims are vastly different from one to the other. There are some jurisdictions that make, as I said earlier, extramarital sex unlawful, even when it's rape, which means if you proactively go out and find victims, you need to understand there's an extra layer of protection and consent that the victims need to go through before you can seek justice on behalf of the fathers. But here's a really important bit. A number of people have said to me in the last little while, their opinion is the victims shouldn't come forward, or their opinion is the victims are putting themselves in danger. My opinion is the victims need to be asked. They need to be given a way to be empowered to make their own decisions, fully informed with the right protections around them. And Chippo, you're exactly right that many social considerations need to be taken into account, and maybe we need to look to amendments to things like the Refugee Convention, where if someone is coming forward to report a sexual exploitation and abuse, they should get some sort of international protection and potentially a rehousing, possibly into the home jurisdiction of the father, if the government of the father wants to take responsibility, perhaps. Asmita asks, how on earth to get governments to support this? Efforts over the years to get an independent body have been stymied by strong institutional resistance from the aid sector. I think that's right, Asmita. What we need to do is empower voices like everyone watching this to put pressure on the governments to say, time is up, enough is enough. We need to put victims' rights first. We've got to empower ourselves to change our government's view. They haven't phrased it this way, but so many people have really said that these sort of abuses are kind of the cost of doing business. Bad things happen in war. Bad things happen in the developing world. It happens over there. And we need to break that excuse. We need to say to governments, no, this is being done on our dime. This is taxpayer funds. How can the British government or the Australian government or the Canadian government tolerate a spending of any of their money, sending a perpetrator from their country overseas for them to abuse women and children? There is no acceptable level of sexual exploitation and abuse. And that's what we've got to start saying, Asmita, to governments, that the words zero tolerance are not enough. The actions zero tolerance need to follow. Jane Campton asks, could it be a special division of the International Court? I really think it could. And these are the sorts of discussions that we need to have, because we're talking about, in effect, an international criminal and international civil jurisdiction for one particular class of victims. And it very well could possibly sit in the division of the International criminal court. King's College would love to house the nascent organisation, if we could get the funding for it, to do more academically defensible research, to look at the ethics, to look at the legal challenge and start to structure it up. Based similarly on the King's Health Partnership that we have in a number of countries, for example, Somalia, Sierra Leone, etc. You could begin a trial organisation in test case countries, for example. We just need one or two governments to come forward and say, it's time we did this. Anonymous asks, do you think education can play a role educating people from childhood about respect for others and human rights and prevent offending to begin with? Well, you could, and indeed here in Australia, we're going through that issue right now. There have been a number of scandals recently about children in schools being involved in sexual abuse of each other. And in fact, this year's Australian of the Year, Grace Tame, won the award as Australian of the Year because of her outspoken and strong and passionate view defending people or children that have been abused by their teachers, as she was when she was in her mid-teens. So every country in the world has this problem. And every country in the world does need to educate people from childhood about respect for others and human rights. But it doesn't matter how much education you have, there will always be perpetrators. And what we need to do is minimise perpetrators. And any criminologist will tell you, size of penalty doesn't deter crime. Fear of detection does. And right now, in the minds of perpetrators in the aid industry, there is zero fear of detection. And even if you thought you were detected, you know you can get away with it because no one has gone to jail. Georgie Lund says or asks, it's great to hear about a proactive approach to preventing sexual exploitation abuse. Have you considered how this will fit with safeguarding more broadly and safer programming, mainstreaming it into each sector? Yes, I have. And my personal view is, though, you've got to start from two ends. One, you say very clearly that you've got to have the right training in place. You've got to have the right preventative tools to stop people coming into the industry or be removed from the industry if they're perpetrators. But at the other end, you've got to have prosecution, because prosecution isn't just punishing the past perpetrator, it's creating a disincentive to future perpetrators. And one of the great fears I have in this work right now is what we are doing is we're raising the awareness of the vulnerability of women and children to sexual abuse in the aid industry. And if we do not put an effective preventative mechanism in place, all we are doing is telling every potential perpetrator that the aid industry is a soft target. This is a real dilemma. I'll take two more questions, then I really have to hand over to the next session. Anonymous asks, what rules would the international body refer to? Is everyone agreed on the exploitation and abuse is to provide a common standard? Yes and no. So there's two ways of looking at this. Remember, in earlier sessions, we've talked about the circumstances of procreation don't matter. The fact of procreation does when it comes to asserting the civil rights for a child support order or a passport, for example. It doesn't matter whether the child is born through rape, abuse, or consensual or transactional sex. For the purposes of child support, the father is just on the hook. How you get the father on the hook will vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction of the father. For the criminal law, one of the reasons we're looking at sexual exploitation and abuse of women and children under the age of 16 is because you can trigger the extraterritorial law and in many cases hold the father to account not in the jurisdiction of the perpetration, but his home jurisdiction. And in the case of aid worker abuse, that means you're taking the perpetrator out of the jurisdiction of a potentially failed state and into a jurisdiction where it's actually working. So the last question I'm going to take is Angela's, and I'm sorry, Saramba, that I've probably not got time to get to yours, but I'll try to jump to it. How do you think that good cooperation inspired by the principle of subsidiarity could be fixed among actors in relationship with this international body? That's a very, very big question, and I think we've got to keep people focused on the objective. That's how to get cooperation. We want to stop the abuse. And if we can keep people focused on that's what our objective is, then hopefully we can get cooperation. And I know there are people at this event now who are objecting to some of the work that I've been leading and doing. And I make the call to them. We've got to put our differences aside and work together if we keep focused on what's in the best interest of the victim and how we empower victims to make the decision for themselves, not have the decisions imposed on them. And Sarumba's question will be my last one before I hand over. How would the independent body seek out victims and confirm the veracity of their allegations? That's a big question. And part of it will be a series of surveys with the ongoing beneficiary population. As Julia Gillard said in her presentation opening this session today, listening to the anecdotal evidence as well. And as many of the speakers have talked about earlier today, lots of people know this is going on. The translators who are doing the deals, the other staff members who see it. It's just that we don't have the mechanisms behind to listen to the victims. That's how I've got to conclude, I'm afraid. Our next session will be institutional barriers to change, where we're going to hear from 4 very powerful speakers indeed. I want to thank you for listening. I want to thank you for the question and answer in this session. I really wish we had some more time. This is the beginning of a journey we all need to go on together. Let's remember, this is about the victims and it's about stopping future perpetrators by creating a fear of detection in the mind of potential future perpetrators and present ones. Thank you for listening. Let's help the victims. The next session will be in the Sessions tab over to the left. So click on your Sessions tab for the next Institutional Barriers to Change session. Thank you very much.